Hello everyone and welcome to this week's episode of Men in Cars, the podcast where we talk about the history of motorsport with or without men. We're on episode 10, guys. I can't believe it, how the time has flown. Really though, this is like the only way I can keep track of how many weeks have gone past. I did miss a couple of weeks in June or July though, so this has been running for like 12 weeks, which is insane. Or maybe 13, because my introduction one kind of counted as an episode as well. Anyway, it's been a while, and we are still somehow coming up with new episodes, so go me. So for this week's episode, I thought of this episode idea kind of like a couple weeks ago, and I thought, it would be fairly like localized to one Grand Prix, as I said at the end of last week's episode. But upon researching, it was kind of like opened a kind of gate to a whole other like realm of history that's a bit more kind of general. I think this week it does have a tie to Formula One, obviously, but for I think a good portion of the episode, I'll be talking about still sports, but it will be a bit wider. So if you're the type of listener who maybe prefers ones who aren't so motorsport heavy, this will be a good one, I think. So as you can see by the title, although I don't know what I'm going to name it, and am I going to name it the Grand Prix, or am I going to name it about sports boycotting? Who knows? Anyway, so this week we're talking about the 1985 South African Grand Prix. So I'm kind of using this Grand Prix as kind of like a way to explore how sports boycotting, or boycotting in general, kind of went about during this period in response to apartheid in South Africa. So I'll first kind of go into a bit about the kind of basics of apartheid, or what it kind of entailed, and then just how the whole kind of process of sports boycotting really went about, because it's really fascinating how different countries, or how it was kind of like dealt with internationally, because it was a really big deal at the time. And it's something that I think, particularly if you're not South African, you like wouldn't really think about or like acknowledge how serious this really was. Like, I've like learnt about apartheid, I think maybe when I was like 13, like the basics, and then again in my A-levels, but that was like really only in reference to how the British government were dealing with it in the 1980s. Spoiler alert, not very well. But it does like seem such a kind of almost like bafflingly like awful kind of thing to happen in the 20th century, and you can still see the like ramifications of that in modern day. So it's a really like important part of history, obviously, to learn about, and it does have ties with how Formula One was dictated and how they dealt with more political crises and how different sporting bodies would really react to this. So to get into this topic, the word itself, apartheid, kind of comes from the Afrikaans word for apartness. So as that implies, it is essentially a law of segregation. And it was really the kind of ideology that was associated or supported by the National Party in South Africa and was introduced in 1948. So of course, kind of ideas of segregation were implemented in South Africa and obviously in many other countries as well. But this was different because it was a law. Like, it was a very heavily enforced, a very heavily policed form of segregation that really severely disadvantaged non-white people. So even though non-white people were really suffering due to racism and segregation previously, now this was brought to a completely different level, because suddenly these ideas of racial superiority were really firmly entrenched in how South African citizens would go about their daily lives. So this meant that throughout the 20th century, it was extremely difficult to break this kind of really fundamental racism in the South African system. And I'll go into this more when we talk about kind of how effective that boycotting was, but a lot of people really source the reason why it kind of went on for so long, or why people supported it, was not only those ideas of racial superiority, but fear, particularly amongst those non-white communities. They were scared that, you know, if they spoke up or did anything to even mildly suggest that they were against this system, they would, you know, be sent to prison or beaten up or lose their jobs, their money, all these types of things, that it was like you were never going to win in this situation. So even small things like if a white person and a non-white person like became friends or had any sort of relationship, that would bring about kind of a lot of suspicion, and it was still possible for you to get arrested. And it was a huge problem, and obviously internationally this began to, you know, get a lot of attention or traction, because by the time you get to the 1980s, it seems, obviously rightly so, an extremely outdated kind of system. And as we'll see, many countries or political parties or individuals did not want to be associated in any way with how these communities in South Africa were being treated. So now we're going to kind of get into sports more specifically, or boycotting, and how different countries would do this. So in terms of sports, obviously all the kind of governing bodies or sporting bodies in South Africa would not allow non-white people to compete in any capacity. They also would not allow teams from kind of non-white countries or teams from countries that had even one non-white player in. They would not let them tour or compete in South Africa either. So this is a very noticeable gap, or a very noticeable difference in terms of how sports competitions were kind of executed in South Africa compared with other countries. And this is particularly prominent. I kind of read a lot about cricket, so this was particularly noticeable because you've got countries like India or Pakistan who countries' teams would compete at very high levels within cricket, but they were not allowed to come to South Africa. So again, I won't go into specifics too much on particular sports, as it's kind of like a lot of information that I don't think I could convey very well. But overall, it was a really kind of South Africa weren't being subtle about it in the slightest. It was a really kind of berating effort to prevent non-white athletes from competing. And this also was extended to audiences as well. And this did cause a lot of protests because sports is a big part of people's culture. And I think that was one of the things that really kind of touched a nerve with a lot of people, because sports is, as I said, such an integral part of people's lives or everyday lives, that it allowed that. I suppose you could argue that kind of made people realise, oh wait, this is really messed up, or I want to change this. But it also kind of, I've read a lot of people talking about how kind of racism and discrimination can almost kind of penetrate society so much more, because you're, infiltrating what people consider a kind of correct culture to be, or you get used to an image of what your interests are, and when that's changed, it can be a bit jarring perhaps. But that being said, there was a lot of kind of, protests and people trying to, fight back on these policies, but particularly obviously during those early years of apartheid and throughout the 1960s, the South African Olympic Games Association in particular was really hard to kind of break. So when you go kind of quite high up in those sort of systems, all those kind of high representatives all have very kind of traditional links, and they're all friends with each other and, things like that. So it made the kind of condemning of those racialist policies so much more difficult to condemn, particularly for those other nations, because it was so easy to just be, passive. So there's an article on the South African history website that goes into this period of history in a huge amount of detail, so if you want to know more, I would suggest going to that, and it's a bit too much to cover in one episode, but I've tried to kind of condense it. But there's a bit that really sums up this period. So it reads, the South African government's response is indicative of the general policy towards sportsmen who have dared to oppose racialism in sport. They are not only condemned by the apartheid sports bodies, but systematically victimised by the government authorities. To advocate open sport is to invite speedy and direct persecution. Numerous leaders of non-racial sport have had to endure severe penalties within South Africa for their determined efforts. So I think that really does show the kind of severity of the situation by the 1960s, and as we start to see the breakdown of the apartheid system or the beginning of boycotting, I think this is really kind of reinforced in a lot of studies of this period, but it took a long time to break down, and obviously a lot longer than it really should have. And as it says in the clip I read out, that systematic victimization from the government was so common, and if you read the full article, they go into a lot more detail about this, but particularly obviously the people who are more likely to speak out about this are non-white people, but the government would not hesitate to immediately condemn, punish those sorts of figures. I mean, look at Nelson Mandela. He was put in prison for 27 years. So as you get to the late 1960s, there's a period or an event where people really felt kind of anti-apartheid actions to be felt in wider society, or to kind of start to have a genuine effect on how these segregation laws are really being conducted. So in 1968, South Africa was excluded from international cricket because the Prime Minister at the time, John Vorster, said he would not allow the England cricket team to tour South Africa. And this was because they had a mixed-race player called Basil d'Oliveira, and because of this one non-white player in their team, they were not allowed. And although in terms of law, it took a while for this to come into effect, I think this rule of only allowing all white sports teams to tour South Africa was actually only lifted when Nelson Mandela became president. But when South Africa were actually excluded from, I don't know if it's a tournament or a championship, I'm sorry, my cricket knowledge is really not that good, but when they were excluded from this competition, that started a real chain reaction of those sporting boycotts. The most notable one was the rugby union, which really was one of those things that I talked earlier about sport being so ingrained in people's culture. So rugby is a really big part of South African culture, is extremely popular, obviously, to this day. So when South Africa's presence in rugby was suddenly being compromised or negatively affected, people, I think the government really started to see that type of unrest in a different perspective. And the sad thing is that the only way the government could start to see apartheid as a negative is when it starts to negatively impact their white citizens, which is obviously really awful, but unfortunately that's how it worked. There were, of course, many other forms of boycott. So you've got foreign banks preventing loans from South Africa. The most notable one, I think, was European supermarkets. I know particularly in the UK. And statistics actually showed that by the kind of mid-1980s, about a quarter, so 1 in 4 Britons, said that they were consciously boycotting South African goods. So there are a lot of campaigns to stop people from buying South African products as a way to go against that policy of apartheid. And you've also got Musicians' Union as well, so lots of musicians, I believe, refused to play in South Africa. I think controversially there are a couple famous ones that still continue to. I'm not 100% sure. I think it was Elton John, maybe Queen, still performed in South Africa, but it was certainly a notable difference that a lot of musicians did not want their music to be played, I believe, on South African radio, things like that. So by the time you get to kind of the late 1980s, the president at the time, F.W. de Klerk, realised that he was kind of fighting a losing battle, that those anti-apartheid sentiments were now moulding into a very real kind of like financial threat, or really affecting South Africa's place in international relations. So after all that boycotting, he was finally ready to release Nelson Mandela from prison and negotiate an end to apartheid. So I suppose all in all, you could argue that all that boycotting was, successful. It did, in effect, end apartheid. But again, like I said before, it was a really long process. And obviously the damage that was done in that period is kind of irreparable. So now we've got that kind of, but it's not really background because it's equal parts of this episode. But anyway, now we've, got the kind of historical context of the time. In terms of Formula One, I'm not sure off the top of my head how long the South African Grand Prix had been running, but it was one of the, main races in the calendar. And I think we see this a lot nowadays, the kind of battles that Formula One as an organisation have in terms of navigating the kind of political climates of the countries that they race in. It is still a very current issue of, the FIA want Formula One to remain this politically neutral championship, but is there such thing as being politically neutral? Because if you're, being passive to a problem, you're kind of part of that problem almost. So it's still a huge debate today, but this 1985 Grand Prix is certainly kind of an example of that sort of debate that would happen amongst these organisations. So before the 1985 South African Grand Prix happened, it was the penultimate race of that season and was scheduled to run on the 19th of October. So obviously there was a huge amount of debate amongst the FIA, or I think it was called the FISA at the time, but I might call it the FIA to avoid confusion. But, it was highly debated whether it would actually go ahead at all, and last minute it did, but this was, of course, not without complication. So one of the main talking points of this Grand Prix was that Renault and Ligier, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, both boycotted the GP. So they are both French teams, and the French government, it says encouraged, but I don't know if they were kind of ordered to, but France's stance was that, they were very firmly against apartheid and did not want to associate with South Africa. So they did not end up representing France in South Africa. And I believe they were the only country to really firmly press this. Brazil also encouraged Ayrton Senna and Nelson Piquet to not participate, but they did in the end. All the drivers and teams that did end up taking part really stated that their FIA and FOCA, which is the Formula One Constructors Association, that their kind of agreement, which was the Concord Agreement, so that was a contract that stated various aspects of the kind of obligations that the drivers and teams had, so which races they had to compete in, and all those details about television revenue, prize money, and sponsorship. So, yeah, it's very easy for me to say, obviously, they should have boycotted it, which, they should have, but they stated these as their reasons against it. The race went ahead and was won by Nigel Mansell, with Keke Rosberg and Alain Prost coming in second and third. I do find it interesting that Alain Prost did race, even though France stopped Renault and Ligier from racing, but that kind of brings in a whole other aspect of, it's probably less, I don't know how it was back then, but maybe less about the specific drivers' nationalities and more about the constructors' nationalities. I think it's probably tied in with aspects of sponsorship and things like that, but yeah, I'm not too sure about, again, how the specifics of that really worked. But after the race finished, the FIA president, Jean-Marie Balest, stated that F1 would no longer race in South Africa, or at least until apartheid was lifted. So this they did, and they only started racing there again in 1992. although that was for a very limited amount of time. I think maybe it was 92 or 93 was their last race in South Africa, but that was probably more for like financial reasons. So although Renault and Ligier were the only constructors or the only teams to officially boycott, it was, a very public action from them. But there was another man who did not start that race, and that was Alan Jones, who was an Australian driver who was driving for the Haas F1 team. And it says on all of the official websites, stats and everything, that Alan Jones was ill. He, was too ill to compete, so he didn't. However, he has since written a book and stated that this was not, in fact, the case. It was because of the dynamics of racing in South Africa and what that would mean for his team sponsors. So during this time, Alan Jones was one of the best drivers on the grid. He had won the championship in 1980, so I'm not sure on the, specifics of the dynamics amongst the drivers on the grid at that time, but, he was an extremely well-known driver or well-known name, so for him to be missing from that Grand Prix would be quite noticeable. So as I said before, in the 1985 season, he drove for the Haas F1 team, and one of their main sponsors was Beatrice, who were a really big company, but relatively unknown in terms of their actual name, but they had a lot of business in America. And because of the kind of nature of their business, or the nature of them being relatively unknown, they were not on the stock market and therefore were able to have considerable manufacturing and operations in tandem with South Africa. So I think many people leading up to the Grand Prix in South Africa began to notice or realise that Beatrice's name would be, promoted, advertised, really like put out there if they were to race in South Africa. And I think the company did not want to be singled out because a lot of companies were, again, boycotting South Africa, but they did not want to, be known as, or to have people's first impressions of their brand to be associated with that country. So because Jones had, fairly earnestly said that he had a good chance of winning the race, I don't know if that's, just him being confident, but probably, again, he was a big name. But before that Grand Prix weekend, Bernie Ecclestone, who, if you don't know, is the owner of Formula One at the time, came up to him beforehand and said, look, you just need to pretend you're ill, go back to Australia and have, a miraculous recovery before your home Grand Prix, and I'll give you the first place prize money if you don't turn up to the race. Now, this does seem like, a very drastic move, but the American civil rights activist Jesse Jackson had actually said that if the Beatrice car races in South Africa, he'll get all of the black workers at that country to go on strike. And of course, Beatrice did not want this to happen. It would have been really detrimental to their productivity, but they also did not want to appear weak or, at the mercy of one individual, particularly a non-white individual. I think Bernie Ecclestone saw the potential for this F1 team to be affected financially and just thought, there's no way of them knowing if you're actually ill or not, so, let's just go for it. And it worked. People believe it. Yeah, but I think the kind of dynamics of Alan Jones not racing in the South African Grand Prix was, obviously it wasn't an official boycott because I'm not sure about the specific definition, but in order to be a boycott, it's for a political reason and it has to be a very public or very clear declaration that you are missing out on something because of your political beliefs or your condemnation of that country. Whereas that was not the case with Jones or with Beatrice. It was just for financial reasons, which unfortunately is a huge motive. And as I said earlier, part of the reason why apartheid was probably drawn to an end anyway was when that, money stopped coming in for South Africa. Yeah, I think that does really speak to, Formula One and I guess society in general, that You know, people in those high positions will only deal with a problem until it starts to impact rich white people negatively. So that is all I have for this episode. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learnt something new, important as well. I hope I have, again, conveyed this in the right way. And yeah, if you want to learn more, I would recommend looking at I always link like the sources in the description of each episode, but they are really interesting. And again, apartheid is a very important topic, but kind of its impact on motorsport or on Formula One is what I find most interesting. And again, those parallels to how Formula One navigates the kind of like political climate of those locations that they race in is really fascinating, and is still an ongoing issue and an ongoing debate. If you enjoyed this episode, please give it 5 stars on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Also subscribe on YouTube and click the little notifications button, so when I upload a new episode you'll get a notification. And now I'm saying that, I think I forgot to upload last week's episode. That's really bad. So if you're a YouTube watcher, you're getting 2 episodes in 1 week. What a win. But yes, I'll probably put a clip or 2 on TikTok if it doesn't get banned, or definitely Instagram Reels. So definitely hop over there and you can see kind of clips from other episodes as well. And yeah, have a good week, good evening, good day if you're listening in the morning. And I'll see you next week for our women's episode. See you next week. Bye.